And so we'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, where we're going to be chatting about Regulation 638 and your traceability system. Will your traceability system meet these new legal requirements? Deirdre is the Regional Product Manager for Syspro Africa. She focuses on understanding the needs and the trends of Syspro's customers, future customers, and I'm sure there are a few of you that are on the line listening to today's webinar, and also getting an understanding of the industries that you operate in and what your specific needs are. Deirdre's been in software licensing support and ERP projects for all her working career. She also manages the Syspro Academy, where Syspro teach their clients how to get the very best out of their software. She has a good understanding that your business is constantly changing, and so that's what sort of fuels her passion to stay informed with trends and engaging with customers to make sure that Syspro fully understands your needs. She enjoys reading a good book, cheers to that, Deirdre, and helping her two daughters explore and discover all the adventures that life has to offer. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Deirdre so that she can take us through today's presentation, and she's going to be our subject matter expert in making sure that we understand exactly what we need to have in place in order to ensure our traceability systems conform to the legal requirements. Deirdre, over to you.
Perfect. So really, I suppose the title says it all. It is about understanding whether or not your current systems are going to help meet the requirements of R638. And it's quite an interesting change for some. It's nothing, I will be honest, from our experience, that's too new to us. From a software perspective and being an ERP provider to multinationals and to the food and beverage industry for quite a good many years, 40 years in fact, we've seen and we've had to incorporate traceability quite often. And there are some challenges around it, but there's also some quick wins, and there's some really simple ways to embrace a traceability system and really get the leverage out of it from an organization perspective. So let's look at what the change is. So if we just change the slide. What we saw introduced was the person in charge of the food premises is responsible to ensure the following. So there is compliance that's going to be required of appropriate records, but records applicable to processing, production, and distribution. And interesting enough, for 6 months after shelf life. That foodstuff manufactured, kept, or sold from the premises complies in all respects to the provisions of the Act and regulations promulgated thereunder, including the labelling thereof. And the other third change, which was quite an important one, was a traceability system is maintained according to the best available method, and recall procedure is in place. And any incident requiring recall is reported. Now, this has been around for agricultural companies and some other companies for quite some time, but obviously now the requirement is across the entire food supply chain that everyone is now adhering to or introducing this traceability system. So I just want to break out some key components on this. So if we just look at the next slide, what's some interesting facts, or I suppose interesting points in some of these changes is, I want to start with the top one. So the interesting thing for me is that it's the person in charge of the food premises is responsible. We're going to touch on this a little bit just now, but this is quite a big one, because we're talking about the keeping of appropriate records. Records with regards to processing, production, and distribution. Again, we're going to unpack this a little bit, what this actually entails and what those kinds of records can be, and the fact that they should be retained for a period of at least 6 months after shelf life of the product. So most lot traceability, this is generally a good standard system requirement, and in fact in some systems this is actually indefinitely kept so that we just have full traceability into the future, but definitely a good idea to have that minimum 6 months after shelf life. Obviously, this depends on product as well. Certain products are going to last a lot longer, so we do have to consider that, especially from a canning perspective in those. Then we also have to look at the labeling. So labeling is quite an important thing, and this is where we're actually going to see that traceability number starting to come on. And how we're actually going to apply that traceability and how we're going to show that from a labeling perspective so that we can reference it back all the way through the system. And then the last area is covering that traceability system. And it's really talking about the best available method. And this will be different per different company, size of organization, what current systems you have available, and if you can, how just best to apply that. In some cases, for some, it might be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, but we're going to just unpack what that real challenge is about keeping it in manual documentation or Excel spreadsheet versus having a system that actually helps drive this traceability as well. And the thing with the traceability is it's not just about being able to trace it, but it's also about being able to have a recall procedure in place. If we are going to end into a situation where we do recall, how are we going to do that? Have we really got the visibility that we need so that if we are placed into a recall situation and we need to report it, that we actually are able to get the full detail of what is required? Okay, so let's start unpacking some of this. So the first one we talked about was that person in charge, and this is the one really challenge here, is that traceability is not about one individual. Traceability is about the entire organization. Everyone involved in the food process really has to be aware and cognizant of traceability. So traceability comes in from our inbound side, from our procurement and our receiving of product. That's really where a lot of our starting point for traceability actually begins. It's then about, once we've got the items in the organization, where do they move? Where are they? Which warehouse are they in? Are they on a specific shelf? If we're moving them into production, do we know when we move it into production? Are we able to track that move into production? And then once it's gone into production of a specific item, do we know what its end result is? So what's the final product that it went into? And then can we trace it from that final product? And then once we've got that final product and we're about to now send it out of the organization, we're distributing it to our customer, do we have that visibility as well? And so one just looks at this alone and goes, this is not one person is potentially responsible for it, but it really is ensuring that everyone in the process and in the different areas of the business are cognizant of it and also doing their part to ensure that we are going to be able to achieve the traceability that we need, as it is spanned across different areas of the organization.
Deirdre, I think what is interesting is the legal liability for the lack of effective traceability would obviously rest fairly and squarely on the shoulders of the person in charge.
Well, yes, and that's where one has to question, without having a system that helps manage this, it's really difficult for one person to own that liability. Is that one person really going to know where every single document is sitting and where every single record is sitting? Especially when, if, for example, our receiving team is on completely different premises to our operations team. So it really does start to highlight where a system is actually, in a sense, going to be able to give that individual the safety, or I suppose the confidence, to know exactly where the traceability is and if they are able to achieve it.
Absolutely. Great. What's next?
Okay, let's change that slide. So when one starts to talk about traceability, especially in the food industry, or what we start to hear a lot about is farm to fork. So when we talk farm to fork, we're talking about the tracking of food from the farm all the way from its roots to the end, which is actually sitting on the consumer's table at the end of the day. And we term this farm to fork traceability as what we call whole chain traceability. And what that means is we can track an item all the way from the very beginning to the plate at the end of the day. Now, this is quite tough because this has dynamics and challenges, because this is not just about one organization. This is multiple organizations. Your farm is different to your manufacturer, your food manufacturer. Your distribution company is different. Potentially, you're outsourcing that, and are they meeting your right storage requirements, and are they keeping track of that item to delivery, where we're actually sitting with the retailer or the restaurant who are actually receiving that, and they are actually the ones at the end of the day handing over to the consumer. So the reality for this, when we talk whole chain traceability, it's not about one company just being traceability aware. It's about all of the different people, organizations in the supply chain doing their bit. And if everyone is doing their part of the traceability circle, we will get what we call that full whole chain traceability. So it really is about coming together. It's about food manufacturers choosing the right suppliers of their raw materials and driving them to have the right things in place, versus retailers doing the same as well, and ensuring that everyone has got the right components in. And it really becomes a partnership across the supply chain in order to achieve this. So if we take that and we unpack it and we go, okay, so we can't necessarily be responsible for the entire chain. How do we be responsible for our own? So us as an organization, as part of that bigger supply chain, what do we need to do? And I think the first thing we need to do is we need to understand what traceability is. So when we talk about traceability for an organization, what we are really looking at is, can you trace one up and one down? So if I am a food manufacturer, my raw materials coming in that I'm going to be using to produce my food, can I trace that back to my supplier? And then once I've manufactured and I've put it into an end product, like, for example, a cooked food item, am I then able to trace where I distributed that to my customer? Now, my customer could be another retailer, it could be a restaurant, it could be an end consumer, but I would need to be able to understand where that went to. So it's not about if there's multiple suppliers. If my supplier is getting it from another supplier, I don't necessarily need to have traceability all the way back to the originator. My supplier, as long as they're giving me traceability and they're doing their part and they've got their traceability from their supplier, that's how we'll start to get that whole chain traceability. So for an individual organization, I think this is a kind of a simple rule really to focus on: one up and one down. That's really in essence what we have to be able to achieve to make sure we're going to meet this requirement. So let's unpack that a little bit more. Let's go to the next slide. And so in theory, what we hear is, well, this seems quite simple. I'm pretty sure I know who I'm going to get it from, and I'm pretty sure I know who I'm going to get it to. So when we just talk about one product and we just think about the fact that there's sugar and it's going into one product, and then that one product's going to one customer, traceability seems simplistic. It seems easy to achieve. Where we start to get complex is when that one, for example, raw material is going into multiple products, and then those products are going to multiple customers or consumers. And then it's about, we start extrapolating that. So now we suddenly start seeing multiple products, and this starts to become very hard to keep track of, especially in a manual system. And this is where we really have to start leveraging off a system that can give us this form of traceability, because that's just one raw material going into one of those products. In essence, there's probably about 15 or 16, and we need to be able to track every single one of those and then all the end consumers, because bearing in mind, if you look at sugar, it's not just one bag of sugar, it's potentially a couple of kilograms of sugar that we are spreading across multiple production jobs. And it's about making sure that we know exactly where that went. And so complexity does start to drive. We have to look at how many products the organization is producing. And the minute we are getting to a certain amount, doing it without a system really does become impractical and really difficult, because this becomes very complex very, very quickly. So theory is great. It's a simple enough concept for some, but when we try and start to extrapolate that and actually look at our product offering, it starts to become very complicated very quickly.
Absolutely, and I think just downright daunting.
Yes, it can actually almost be overwhelming because you kind of start to wonder if it's ever achievable, but it is. So some things that we need to consider then, bearing this in mind, is firstly, not everything has to be traceable. So one has to wonder about looking at your products, your items, what does need to be traceable and what doesn't need to be traceable. So there are certain components that are not going to be traceable. For example, your cleaning products to clean the factory potentially don't have to be traceable in the sense of I need to know where they were sourced from. We trace the fact that we potentially utilized them, but they themselves don't have to be traceable and unique. What we also see is the process impact and the capture points. So when we are being traceable, what we're saying is that an item, for example, my sugar, has a unique code. It has a unique identifier for that bag of sugar. The next bag of sugar has a completely new lot number as well, what we term a lot number, and that makes that unique. And so the tracking is about, at the time of capture, receiving coming in, have I got that unique number? Then when I'm using it and I'm issuing it into production, am I tracking that number as well so that I know which bag of sugar went into production? And then ultimately, because that's now part of my finished item, my energy drink, for example, will have its own lot number, but it's got what we call a parent-to-child relationship. So it knows that my energy drink, here's its lot number, but the component, being the sugar that went into it, has a unique identifier as well. So when we are setting up things like bills of materials or jobs where we are issuing items to production, and production can be many things. It could be the creation of food or an energy drink in this example. It's about making sure that we've identified certain items as being lot traceable and that we have got capture points every step of the way with that item to record that so that we've got visibility of it. So recording of data becomes critical. And this is where we go back to that slide from a few minutes earlier where it's not just about one person. It's about every person that transacts with that item, making sure that they are recording the usage or that item at every single stage. And this is where we have to start enabling people and really train them across the organization to understand the importance of this. It's not about, oh no, I forgot to do it, or I forgot to write on the paper, I forgot to put it in the Excel spreadsheet. If we've got, for example, the right system in place, that the system actually forces the control, that the system actually ensures that we cannot carry on until the data that is crucial is actually applied. And for users, I think this is where the change management really becomes important. It's the change management for them to understand the risk to the organization, the risk to the business, that if we don't have this data, what the repercussions of that potentially is going to be, and where we are going to sit potentially in a situation where we're not going to be able to meet that requirement, that legislative requirement. And so it becomes quite important when we are looking at a traceability system is to consider quantity. So one-on-one is always easy, so we go back to that simplicity versus complexity. It's easy to think about bringing in one bag of sugar, but if you think about the fact that potentially I get a pallet delivery of sugar, that's not just one bag. We're potentially talking 20, 30 bags. And it's about how we make sure that when we are capturing that it's actually quite simple to do and it's not complicated and we don't have to unpack a whole pallet. And how do we make sure that we're going to be able to record every single one of those items? And this is where really looking at your process and doing a walkthrough of your process, understanding your different products, understanding how they get delivered and arrive into the organization, for example, on pallets versus individual items, but also how they get issued to our production. Really understanding and mapping that process becomes quite important so that we can drive adoption and simplicity of traceability into the organization as well, so that we can actually really understand where our touch points are. So I'm going to break it down into 3 areas. So when we looked at the 3 areas earlier, we talked about inbound, operations, and outbound. So if we look at inbound, it's about understanding when we're bringing items into the organization, how are we recording the lot numbers coming in? Are we able to record the lot numbers coming in? And really that's our first starting point, because that's our one down. Our one down is from our supplier, have we already got traceability there? And part of this might require that conversation with the supplier, because potentially they're still putting in the traceability on their side as well. And it's about understanding how we're going to achieve this to make sure that we've got the visibility. And so the next thing one has to consider is, if your supplier is unable to or not providing you with a lot number that you can use as your source, will your system, or are you able, when an item is coming into your organization, to assign it its own traceability or lot number there and then? So certain different systems will allow different things. From our experience, we allow for both. So either I'm using the supplier's lot number coming in, or I can, on certain items, at the time of receiving stock into the organization, we can allocate or assign our own number in the event that there's not a traceable number available. And at least you can then begin to start your own traceability and still have it linked back to source. Another area where we see scanning really try and optimize this, scanning with labels and barcodes that have our lot numbers involved in it, really does improve and streamline this process. So we look at scanning in different ways. We can either have the scanning label or the item for scanning on the product, or we actually see this coming in from a delivery sheet, and we actually see the barcode on the delivery document, and that tells us what our lot numbers or our items are as well, so that we can try and make the capturing of the data easier. The easier we can make it, the more likely we are to get it accurate and people adopting it, because it's not difficult to do. And so it really does match up to our purchase order receiving. So when we've got that purchase order, we know it's coming in. Have we got everything we need to record and get the traceability cycle started at that point already? So just some things to really consider from the inbound side when introducing traceability. So if we now go to the next slide and we look at what happens during the process, we've got a couple of considerations here as well. We've got quality and sampling. So when we are producing, oftentimes we're pulling out portions for quality and sampling, and it's being able to record that as well, so that we know a portion of our items potentially went into that and actually didn't end up as a consumer. So during our production process, we are taking quality and sampling portions out, and we've got traceability of that. It's about when we're issuing into production, into the manufacturing process, that at issuing of our raw materials from our warehouse into the factory, that we are issuing the lot numbers, so we know exactly what was allocated. And so we start to get visibility of that parent or that child going into the parents. We also understand that there's going to be an amount of wastage potentially, and it's about making sure we know what that wastage amount is, so that we can also have visibility of where the whole consumption of the product went. And we see here mobility scanning coming in. So if we think about mobility, what we see quite a few of our clients doing on the production floor is they're walking around with phones or mobile devices, where we are actually able to do the shop floor data collection through every stage and watch that lot production move. Or we do this with scanning. And in essence, where we're doing process and we've got a machine that we know we can connect to via IoT, here what we're able to do is get the machine to also start to tell us information about where it's gone and where it's moved. And the point of this area is that if at any point we have to stop an item, we know exactly where in the production cycle it is, and we know exactly where we need to go to pull a specific item off the line if we needed to. So visibility during our manufacturing process is also just as important, so that we can have a quicker turnaround time if we need to pull something off and potentially bring a new product on and already get a new product being made by eliminating the tainted or the product that potentially has an issue. So just from a manufacturing perspective, we see quite a lot of importance there. And then ultimately, we've got our one up. So now what we need to do is we need to know where our customer or who's got our product at the end of the day. So who has it? When did we give it to them? So our time frames. Physical location, so where? So potentially what we've done is we've gone straight to a retailer's DC, but we will at least know that that was the last stop point, and that potentially that retailer, hopefully from there onwards, has got traceability as to what stores it went to, and they'll be able to carry on that holistic traceability chain. What was given? So in essence, there might be a certain lot, but not all lots. So we may have given them an order that had about 5 different lots of items, but only the one needs to bring the right things back. And so in essence, those are the 3 main circles of traceability that we have to focus on, and we have to look at how we've got traceability in all 3 of those areas. Just change the slide, thank you. And the reality is things go wrong. It is a tough one though, because it doesn't go wrong all the time. So putting in traceability, it's kind of like sometimes you have to buy insurance. You hate buying insurance, but you have to, just in case something goes wrong. And it's the same with traceability. You have to actually now put it in play for in case something does go wrong. So what we first see is we see the introduction of something called a mock recall. So a mock recall allows us to test our ability to recall. Have we really got everything in place and in the right places and set up in the right way, so that if we ever need to do a recall, that we actually are comfortable that we are going to be able to achieve this, and that we are going to be able to achieve it in a time frame that is actually effective. When we talk about mock recall, it's really about testing our ability to recall. It's a really good way for us as an organization to make sure we are validating our process. If something is wrong in our process, when we initiate a mock recall, it's going to come out. We're not going to be able to have that full track and traceability. So it also helps us as a business to make sure that our processes are right and in the right places, because it will give us either the visibility we need or the visibility we don't. It's also going to test our data accuracy. It is going to identify if we've got any challenges, and potentially there's areas we need to improve on to make sure that our data accuracy is in fact correct and it's the right thing. And it really is, mock recall it's not about stopping, it's about testing. It's good practice to be able to test that we are able to recall, so that if we are ever in that situation where it's a true recall, we as a business are already comfortable and confident that this is going to work and we are actually going to be able to achieve a full recall. So when we look at a recall, which the requirement requires us to be able to go into recall, now we're talking an actual execution. We have identified there's a product, there's something wrong, and we need to execute a recall, which in essence basically means stop that item from going any further, or if it's already gone, at least knowing where it went to, so that we can engage with those customers and start to get those items returned. And so it's important that we are able to identify that. We're able to identify the products, where they are, and so that we can put them into quarantine. I have to be able to execute it, know what product it is we're returning, identify it, quarantine it. So quarantine means if it's still in our organization, quarantine it there and then. If it's sitting part of production, quarantine it. If it's still sitting in our raw materials area, quarantine it. Pull it out straight away. And most systems will, definitely our system, it will actually stop any transaction process on that item. It doesn't matter how hard anyone tries, they're not going to be able to initiate a process or a transaction with that because it is in quarantine. And then it also initiates our returns process, knowing who the customers were that got the item so that we can start that return initialization. And then it's about holding the stock as well. So putting the stock on hold and making sure it's stopped in the process. This then gives us the ability to now root cause analysis. If we are now able to identify that our finished item, there was one raw material that was the root cause of the problem, because we've got the traceability from the inbound side already, we're already able to start going back to our supplier and notifying them that this is the cause or potential area that we've got a problem on, and we can start that root cause as to what's initiated. So when we talk recall, we talk it in two ways. One is testing our recall process with a mock recall and making sure that we're going to have that visibility, and then obviously when we head into that recall phase, are we definitely certain that we're going to be able to stop everything? Okay.
What's also interesting now is that where previously, a company could recall product and not notify the Department of Health, we now have this as a specific legal requirement that the department, the local municipality, and the National Directorate of Food Control have to be informed when we initiate a recall.
Correct. So they have to be informed, yes, and they have to be able to, we have to be able to notify them. And they're going to require all of this detail. They're going to want to see that detail and know exactly what the impact of that recall is as well.
Absolutely.
So, for example, this was just a recall example that I wanted to highlight, is that if you have got an item that is a lot traceable item, what you really want to know is you want to know who are the affected customers, who are the affected suppliers. So the final product has a raw material and potentially there's 4 or 5 suppliers that supplied raw material into that final product. We haven't done root cause analysis yet. But what I can already start doing is I can already start seeing where my potential supplier issues are or who I should be engaging with, and start to bring them into the process as well. Affected sales orders. So if we have any open orders that potentially this item's on, it hasn't left the door yet, but straight away we'll be able to stop those. And affected purchase orders. So again, seeing what that total quantity was, that initial lot item, that unique identifier, so that we've got that full traceability. And then any jobs, any production, manufacturing jobs that are currently ongoing, if this item is currently part of a production job, can we see it straight away? And can we put a stop to that or pull it off the line so that we can eliminate and quarantine it straight away? So it really is about being able to have a system or a process that in essence is going to give you that ability in a very short space of time to have this visibility and be able to see it straight away.
I think this is an absolutely critical slide because, it's all very well to be considering the customers, but what about things that are in process and could, still in the pipeline? You don't want to keep sending out product that is, is contaminated. But I think we almost always focus on the customer and forget about the jobs that are actually in production. So very important information that we need to take from this slide. Thanks, Deirdre.
Thanks. And so I just wanted to bring this one in because, chatting to quite a few of our customers, like I mentioned earlier, it's about having that grudge person of insurance. Like, I've got to put this, but what if it never has to be used? So you think about the thought that you've now got to introduce a system, or that you've got to put in a lot of additional process, which at the end of the day is going to cost you money to some extent. But the reality is, how do we get more leverage out of this? How can we really, as a business, gain more from this? And one interesting concept that I really love at the moment is the hyper-connected consumer. When we are looking at the consumers nowadays, especially with the millennials and Generation X and all of those, what we see is there's a lot of focus on healthy living, a lot of focus on ethical living and product experience. And what they really want to know is they want to know what's gone into their food. And so it's about how do we potentially use this by putting in traceability. It really should give us a nice view into what's going on in our product and where our products ended up, but potentially also look at it and go, well, how do we use this to also engage with our hyper-connected consumer and bring them into the process so that they are also aware of the visibility that they ultimately want. They want to know what's gone in. So if we are being more traceable, we are being more transparent about this, we are actually going to meet this need of the hyper-connected consumer and be able to engage with them at this level and really start to build our brand promise as well. And that's why if we can achieve that one up, one down and start to get that holistic supply chain, we really can start to leverage this quite well. And we really will, in two ways. The consumer will know more about us, but potentially as well, we can know more about our consumer. And this is really, I suppose, what all marketing teams and brand teams and really business teams want to know. They want to know how they can improve and how they can get consumers more engaged with their product. So what's in my food is really, these are the types of campaigns and initiatives we see becoming more and more prevalent and more popular. And so when we start to expand as to how we can add added ROI about introducing of traceability, it's not just about a legislative requirement. It's also just about maybe leveraging that to better engage and better share and give transparency about what's in the product. So if I am looking at that source, I would like to know that it's coming from a farm potentially in the Eastern Cape, and this is the farmer, and this is their business and ethical practices. That's really what the consumers are starting to push for. And
for this in South Africa, are you seeing an increasing awareness? I mean, it's obviously very big in Europe and in some sort of more developed markets, but are you seeing an uptake in South Africa?
So definitely more and more on certain products, not necessarily on all products, but definitely on the healthier, when we look at our fruits and when we look at our healthier options, organic ranges, that sort of thing, very, very much more awareness around that, awareness. And I do think with the younger generation, they definitely are pushing for more and more of this. Definitely internationally with our international clients, it is a big, big trend. And I do think from a South Africa perspective, it is growing momentum, potentially not as fast, but definitely on the rise. And so what I just wanted to round back to is just a reminder as to when we are looking at traceability, a couple of ideas. So remember, the one is it's about safety. It's about making sure we can keep our consumers safe and that we have the ability to pull back, quarantine, and recall if necessary to save lives at the end of the day. Because unfortunately, with regards to this, it can kill people, sadly. And so safety should be the number one concern. Safety should be the number one reason to introduce traceability so that we as an organization can be responsible and fall into that full recall process and bring the items back in. The other trick, and I just want to leave everyone with this, is about when you are introducing this, keep it simple. Try not to overcomplicate it. Sometimes people just want to take it that little bit to the nth degree, but a lot of systems are really geared to do the simplicity and make it easy. Make it easy for people that need to capture the data. Make it as simple as possible and really understand how you can improve that simplicity so that you're going to get the data accuracy you need. And then ultimately, in order to make sure you are going to get that return on investment by introducing traceability, look at the ways you can leverage the information. It really will bring a lot of data into your organization and a lot of data that can actually drive business decisions and really give you more insight into your own product and into your own processes and how you can improve processes. And bearing in mind, the more we can improve efficiency, it generally has an indirect cost improvement, or it does help from an expense perspective when we start to improve efficiencies. So look at the ways that you can, by introducing that, get a higher return on investment for your organization as well.
I think one of the interesting things that has come out of the listeriosis outbreak is the fact that we now have this new legislation. I don't think the timing is coincidental. There were problems during the listeriosis outbreak in tracing product and in recalling product, and so this legal requirement was, to try and prevent this from happening again. I love the fact that you say it must be simple, because I think sometimes we can overcomplicate something which is quite simple. And if we approach it from a, what return on investment can we get, and the project is structured like that, it almost, that grudge purchase factor goes away, because the system starts to pay for itself. So I think there's, some great advice in what you're saying. In terms of applications, where you've successfully rolled out your system, and maybe you can just sort of take us through, perhaps a case study where you've seen that the software has really worked very successfully.
So I will be honest, I've had to engage in quite a few different organizations, and like I said, we've definitely done this quite often with a lot of our international companies as well. And it really does boil back to that understanding what your touch points are. So for example, where we have seen the challenges with one or two of our customers was they didn't understand that their stock would arrive on pallets, for example. And what happened was they needed to record the lot number at every single item, which is correct. And when the pallet arrived, they suddenly now had to unpack everything just so that they could record the lot numbers, because the lot numbers were on their bags. And when one thinks about that, you go, oh, it's a practical, when you talk about it, it just makes practical. It's almost like, oh, but that's common sense. Why didn't they think about it? But when you are designing, you're often not on the floor. What people forget sometimes to do is just go on the floor and do that walkthrough. Actually look at the different touch points and how things come in, and really visualize that, and make sure that when you are putting in the system that you've catered for those little nuances. Because I've often seen clients, or we've helped when clients have come across to our system, what we've seen, the challenges was they were constrained by that, because when they did the design, that practical, almost common sense was missed. It wasn't understood. And so it actually added more processes and more frustration than anything else. So it really is, if there's one thing I can really encourage people, is it's about do that walkthrough, even if it's take photos and model every single item as insignificant as it is before design. Make sure you understand that and build that into your process and how you're going to manage that, so that when your pallet does arrive, it's about being able to rather have it on a sheet, a delivery sheet, or even if your supplier does it via app, potentially, you can scan the lot numbers from the documents or the delivery item note, rather than actually scanning each individual item. Obviously, you spot check your pallet and make sure that your numbers are pretty right, pretty much accurate. But it is one of those things to be cognizant of, and just be practical about that approach.
Business. You've said just in terms of walking the processes, that's very good advice. If I think about how we would tell a company to implement HACCP, it's exactly the same approach. Walk the line, look to see what's actually happening. And sometimes we can think we're very clever sitting in the boardroom designing systems, but actually the best ones are designed on the floor.
Correct. And most systems will cater or tailor to that complexity. So one could start off as simple as just capture the lot number up front, and then you've got it, and put it into production manually and record that, and then once you sell it, sell it. But when we do see more complexity, it makes sense to start considering things like your shop floor data collection points. That driving that automation can make a big difference, but in a smaller company, that could be quite expensive or costly potentially, or overkill in that essence. And so it's also about making sure that the system can be tailored to simplicity and complexity, and a good system and the right system will cater for both. It will allow you to start simple and build to complex if required.
And then one more question in relation to defending myself from a due diligence perspective. In other words, being able to prove that I've done all the right things. Something that must be very critical in the design of a system like this is making sure that you have all the right records to be able to demonstrate the traceability process that you've implemented.
Yes, and I suppose that's where it really comes down to that mock recall process. If you cannot do that mock recall, you cannot guarantee that you are going to be able to recall an item, because the mock recall is going to give you that. It's going to give you that visibility. Remember, all the way down to our purchase order. So if we are starting at the right place on our inbound, all the way down to my supplier's purchase order, I should have that traceability, and I should be able to say, I can categorically, hand on heart, that item came from that supplier. And that's where it's really important that it's not just about putting in the process, but it's about testing that process continuously. Obviously, we don't have to do it every day, but at least once a month, or different regulations require different timeframes. But it's about making sure that we have got that visibility. And systems nowadays, we've got the right system, they allow for importing of attachments. So if we need to know what the breakdown of a product is so that we can put it into labeling, it's going to allow that. And it's going to allow manufacture dates and expiry dates so that we can check our shelf life, and we can check for how long an item is, and we can check that an item is not expired before throwing it into production. Those are the different additional adds that having the right system and the right process and being able to check that will give you.
What's interesting is that, you know, I get daily alerts from either the US or the UK where products are being recalled. And I think, you know, one of the things that we were almost stumped by with the listeriosis outbreak was the fact that we had this massive national recall. But it doesn't seem to be it seems to happen in other parts of the world a lot more regularly. So perhaps we should be having more recalls.
So ideally, I think we should. I do think part of the challenge, though, is sometimes you don't want to admit to it because you kind of want to just keep it under wraps, because it can do a lot of brand damage and reputational damage as well. So companies do also kind of want to retain it and keep it in-house. And so for me, I think the important thing is that notification to the governing body that if you are going to recall, that you've got that. Because I do think it's important that we start being honest about it, because when we start improving things, all we're doing is we're going to make it better. So even this introduction, it's not about hitting someone over with a stick and saying you will do this. It's about making sure we are protecting everyone going forward, and that the consumer is protected at the end of the day as well. And it's just about making us better at what we do.
And I suppose finally, we are all consumers anyway, and so we want to make sure our health is protected. And so although we might be working in the food industry and having to comply with this legislation, I think as consumers we definitely see the need for this kind of system, and we actually want it.
Yes, I think it's very important that us as consumers, and myself included, is that we do need to hold companies more responsible. I think that we trust companies to do it, and I think if anything, what listeriosis maybe surprised us with was the realization that potentially there was not enough governance or rules in place to protect us. And so it's an important factor as well.
Absolutely. Deirdre, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I think the way that you've explained traceability and highlighted aspects such as waste, you know, rework, making sure that all of those things are also taken into account in our traceability systems. The fact that you've highlighted the simplicity and the need to ensure that we get a return on our investment. I think these are such good business principles that you've shared with us. And while I know that not everybody could necessarily afford a software system, but even taking these principles and applying them in a manual system, I think everybody can definitely improve the systems that they have. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to working with you more in terms of improving traceability in the food industry in South Africa.
Thanks, Linda. It's been a great pleasure, and I really do hope that it gives people insight and food for thought, I suppose, and just really, just keeping those those key points in mind, and don't let yourself get overwhelmed. But thank you for having me.
Thank you, Deirdre. Thanks so much for your time. We'll chat soon. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to getting the link, which will give you the recording of today's webinar, so that you can go through it again and share it with your team to make sure that your traceability system has taken all of these very important points into account. Have a good afternoon, and we'll chat soon.